Stop confusing motivating operations with discriminative stimuli. One means you want it, the other means you can actually get it. If you mix them up, you fail the exam and you fail the client.
Yeah, you really do.
Welcome to this specialized deep dive for behavioral intelligence. Today, we are pulling apart a massive stack of BACB 6th edition study guides, Cooper text excerpts, and a bunch of mock exam questions to master section G.5. That is motivating operations and discriminative stimuli.
Right.
And we're talking directly to you, the practitioner who wants to elevate their clinical game to the highest possible level.
Because, this isn't about memorizing flashcards or regurgitating textbook definitions. It is about clinical precision. Our goal today is to build top 1% BCBA practitioners who can execute these concepts seamlessly in the clinic, the home, and, school environments.
Absolutely.
If you cannot look at a severe behavior and immediately identify the antecedent variables controlling it, you are just guessing. In high-performance behavior analysis, we do not guess.
No, we definitely don't. But, the terminology alone trips people up, mostly because it sounds like dry academic jargon.
Oh, totally.
But in reality, these are the invisible forces driving every single behavior we engage in, from grabbing a cup of coffee to managing severe aggression. So let's start with the absolute foundation, the motivating operation or the MO.
Right. So an MO is an environmental variable that fundamentally changes the current state of the individual. And it has two distinct immediate effects.
Okay, break those down for us.
First, you have the value-altering effect. This means the environment temporarily increases or decreases the reinforcing effectiveness of a specific stimulus, object, or event.
Got it.
And second, you have the behavior-altering effect. This means the environment either evokes or abates the current frequency of all behavior that has been reinforced by that specific stimulus in the past.
Okay, wait. So it changes how much you want a specific thing, and it changes what you are physically willing to do right now to get that thing. That feels, straightforward on the surface, but it gets complicated because that motivation can swing into completely opposite directions depending on the environment.
Which is exactly why we divide MOs into two functional categories based on that value-altering effect. We have establishing operations, or EOs, which increase the value of a reinforcer.
Like when you really need something.
Right. Deprivation is the clearest example here. Think about sleep. If you are deprived of sleep for 48 hours, the value of a bed skyrockets. That state of deprivation is the EO.
Wow.
Conversely, we have abolishing operations, or AOs, which decrease the value of a reinforcer. Satiation drives the AO. If you just slept for 14 straight hours, a bed momentarily loses all its power to reinforce your behavior.
Because you're totally full of sleep, basically.
Exactly.
So then we have the other side of the equation, which is where the clinical confusion really starts. Sitting right next to the MO is the discriminative stimulus, the SD. Our sources define the SD as a stimulus that signals the differential availability of reinforcement based on a past learning history.
Yeah, and the operative word there is availability. An SD functions entirely on a history of correlation.
What does that mean in practice?
Well, in the past, when this specific visual, auditory, or environmental stimulus was present, a specific behavior resulted in reinforcement. Therefore, the SD acts as a signal. It tells you the store is open.
Okay, I like that. The store is open.
But crucially, it does not make you want what the store is selling.
Wait, let's unpack this with an analogy from the mock exams. Think about running a marathon. Say you are at mile 20 of a 26.2-mile race. You're sweating buckets, totally dehydrated and exhausted.
Oh yeah, you're in bad shape.
That extreme thirst, that biological state of severe deprivation, is your MO. It is an establishing operation making water incredibly valuable to you in that exact moment.
Right, and it is also behavior altering. That extreme thirst means you will start emitting behaviors. Looking around frantically, altering your pace, asking bystanders to find water.
Right, but just because I am desperate for water doesn't mean a water station magically appears on the race course.
No, it doesn't.
I can want it with every fiber of my being, but until I see that table stacked with paper cups at mile 21, the water simply isn't available. So that visual sight of the water table ahead, that is the SD.
Yes, and that illustrates the divide perfectly. The EO creates the momentary burning desire, but the SD signals the actual availability of the reinforcement. You need both for the behavior of grabbing a cup to occur.
Well, makes so much sense.
Consider the inverse of that scenario. What if you just drank a massive jug of water right before crossing the starting line? You're in a state of satiation.
So an AO is heavily in effect.
Exactly. You see the exact same water station at mile 1. The SD is fully present, signaling availability, but you run right past it. The availability hasn't changed. The motivation has.
It's so easy to see when we were talking about biological needs like thirst or sleep, but applied behavior analysis is much messier because we are dealing with complex social and environmental contingencies.
Very meth.
We need to translate that marathon into a real-world scenario. Let's say you have an overbearing boss who constantly texts you extra work assignments on the weekends.
Ugh, the worst. But the mechanics of that scenario mirror the marathon perfectly, just with different variables. Receiving that text message from your boss is the MO.
Okay.
Specifically, it acts as an establishing operation for escape. Because the text is an aversive stimulus, getting away from the work suddenly becomes highly valuable.
But the text itself isn't the SD, right? It's just creating the condition where I want to escape. The actual SD, the signal that I actually can escape, depends entirely on my physical context.
Context is everything in behavior analysis. Let's say your phone buzzes with that extra work text while you are physically sitting in the office on a Friday afternoon, surrounded by your boss and your coworkers.
Okay, terrible timing.
The office environment functions as an S-delta, a stimulus delta, for the behavior of ignoring the text. An S-delta signals that reinforcement, in this case, successfully escaping the work demand, is not available.
Because if I ignore the text while sitting at my desk, our sources dive heavily into conditioned motivating operations, or CMOs. These are variables that alter the value of things strictly because of an individual's unique learning history.
Yeah, and we need to look closely at the transitive CMO, the CMOT. A CMOT is a stimulus that makes another stimulus highly valuable. It transfers the motivation from one item to another.
Give me an example of that.
The classic clinical example involves a learner playing with a complex toy set. But a crucial piece is missing.
Like trying to build a specific Lego set, but the instruction manual is missing. Or trying to play a video game, but the controller isn't plugged in.
Yes. The learner wants to operate the toy, which is their baseline motivation. But the sudden absence of the crucial piece acts as the CMOT.
Oh, I see.
In an instant, the missing piece and the act of asking for it, or the specific tool needed to retrieve it, becomes highly valuable. The environment created a roadblock, and that roadblock transferred the motivation to whatever solves the problem.
So I get that a missing toy piece makes you want the missing piece. It creates a desire to obtain something to complete a sequence. But what happens when the motivation isn't about getting something you want, but actively avoiding something terrible?
Right, the warning signal.
Yeah, the text brings up the concept of a warning stimulus, the reflexive CMO, or CMOR. They use the example of receiving a text message with an angry face emoji from a partner.
The mechanism behind the CMOR is critical for anyone writing severe behavior plans. A CMOR is a stimulus that systematically precedes some worsening condition. It is a warning signal.
Okay.
Over time, because of the individual's learning history, the warning signal itself takes on the aversive qualities of the worsening condition it predicts.
So when I see that angry emoji on my phone screen, my heart rate spikes before I even read the message. The emoji predicts a massive argument when I get home.
Yes. And because it predicts a worsening condition, the CMOR establishes its own termination as a reinforcer. It evokes intense avoidance behavior.
So what does the person do?
Instead of driving home after work, the person pulls into a sports bar to delay the inevitable argument.
This is a huge realization. That person is completely free to go to that sports bar on any given Tuesday. The sports bar didn't suddenly become more available.
Right, the SD didn't change at all.
The sports bar just became highly desirable because of the warning stimulus. The motivation to avoid home skyrocketed, which changed their entire evening routine.
Translating that to the clinic is where you find your clinical power.
Hmm.
If you are a practitioner and your client starts engaging in severe self-injurious behavior, the exact second you pull out a specific red data binder,
Oh, wow.
that binder is a CMOR.
Yeah.
It systematically precedes demands. It is the warning stimulus. The client is engaging in severe behavior to terminate the presence of the binder. You cannot just treat the consequences. You have to manipulate the MO.
And because these concepts, the MO and the SD, happen simultaneously in the natural environment, practitioners constantly tangle them up in the field.
All the time.
And if you misdiagnose the antecedent, your entire intervention plan collapses. We need to dissect the common traps. Trap number 1 is the deeply held belief that an SD somehow creates motivation.
This assumption catches so many well-meaning practitioners off guard. An SD only signals availability. It has zero power to create internal motivation.
Give me a visual for that.
Think of a plate of warm, fresh chocolate chip cookies sitting on the kitchen counter. That visual stimulus is an SD. It signals that the cookies are available to eat.
But if I just finished a massive, heavy Thanksgiving dinner, I am in a state of complete satiation. An abolishing operation, an AO, is heavily in effect.
Exactly. You could stare right at those cookies. The SD is glaringly present, signaling full availability, but you will walk right past them without taking a bite.
Right.
The SD does not magically force you to eat. The MO has to be present. If you assume that simply presenting an SD like placing a token board in front of a client or giving a vocal instruction will automatically evoke a behavior, you are completely ignoring their internal state of deprivation or satiation.
Which leads right into trap number 2, the exact inverse. The belief that an MO creates availability.
Oh, this one is huge.
Clinicians sometimes think that just because a client desperately wants a break, their EO for escape is sky high, it somehow means the break is actually available to them in the environment.
And that misunderstanding leads to massive clinical failures. A client can be in a state of extreme deprivation for attention. The EO is peaking.
Right.
But if the environment does not contain a clear SD signaling that appropriate communication will actually yield that attention, what happens? They resort to problem behavior.
Wow.
Wishing for a reinforcer, no matter how intensely, does not make it appear. You have to ensure the environment clearly signals the path to success.
This brings us to trap number 3, which is arguably the most dangerous for both the exam and actual clinical practice. It involves confusing the effect of non-contingent reinforcement, or NCR.
The fundamental misunderstanding of the mechanics of NCR is fascinating. Many clinicians implement NCR by providing free, time-based access to a reinforcer, and they believe they are altering the SD.
They think they are changing the antecedent trigger or the availability.
Yes, but they are not doing either of those things.
NCR has nothing to do with availability or triggers.
Nothing at all. When you give free, continuous access to a reinforcer, you are diminishing the desire for it. NCR is an abolishing operation. It is a direct MO manipulation.
So how does that look with a client?
Well, if a client hits peers to get access to candy, and you place candy on a fixed-time 5-minute schedule, you are intentionally flooding the environment with candy. You are forcing a state of satiation.
So they don't even want it anymore.
Right. The client no longer needs to hit anyone because the value of the candy has temporarily flatlined to zero. You targeted the MO, not the SD.
Because practitioners constantly confuse these two concepts in the field, it is exactly where test writers set their traps on the exam. We need to decode the Pearson VUE logic found in these mock exams.
Definitely.
If a listener is sitting for the test, how do they mathematically prove if a scenario is describing an MO or an SD?
You have to look at the mechanical function described in the question prompt. Let's break down the rules of engagement. When you read a scenario, ask yourself, did the environment just signal that the store is open?
Okay.
If the question asks what signals that reinforcement is available, or uses words like cue or availability, you choose SD.
Because the cue doesn't make you hungry, it just points to the food.
Right. But if the question asks what alters the current value or effectiveness of a consequence, you are looking at an MO. The key phrase to hunt for is value altering.
What if the scenario describes the client's historical access to something? Like, Jimmer has not had access to his iPad for 3 days.
Then the test is describing a state of deprivation or satiation. You immediately choose EO or AO. 3 days without the iPad is an establishing operation. It drives the value up.
And if he had it all day?
If the prompt says Jimmy had free access to the iPad all morning, that is an abolishing operation. It drives the value down.
And what about the tricky ones? The severe behavior questions where the lines get blurry?
If the question asks about a warning stimulus that precedes a worsening condition, a specific teacher walking into the room, a specific demand being placed on the desk, and the client immediately engages in avoidance behaviors, you choose CMOR.
Got it.
The test writers will try to blur the lines by making the warning stimulus look like an SD. But remember, the CMOR changes the value of escaping. It doesn't just signal availability.
Let's push this beyond passing a multiple choice test. We are talking about the top 1% BCBA mindset. If you are staring down a severe behavior intervention plan, how do you use this distinction between the SD and the MO to actually change a life?
Elite clinicians do not just react to behavior after it happens. They manipulate the antecedent variables before the behavior ever occurs.
Right.
To do that, you have to know which lever you are pulling. There is a question in our source material, Mock 1, question 142, that perfectly contrasts functional communication training, FCT, with NCR.
FCT and NCR are the heavy hitters of antecedent interventions, but they operate on entirely different mechanical levels.
They do. FCT changes the way a person gets a reinforcer. When you implement FCT, you are teaching the client a new response to an SD. You give them a communication card to ask for a break.
But FCT does not change the fact that they still desperately want the break. The MO remains extremely high.
Exactly.
You just gave them a safe, appropriate vehicle to drive toward the reinforcer instead of throwing a chair. But the engine, the motivation is still running hot.
NCR, however, is the opposite lever. When you use NCR, you directly target the MO. By flooding the environment with a reinforcer on a time-based schedule, you create an AO.
You kill the motivation entirely.
Yes. The client no longer needs to use their SCT communication card, let alone throw a chair, because the value of the reinforcer is currently 0.
This is the critical decision point for a clinical director. If I have a client engaging in severe, highly dangerous behavior, say intense physical aggression towards siblings, I might not have the luxury of time to teach a new FCT response while they are highly motivated and dangerous.
That is the essence of clinical power right there. In that severe scenario, you pull the MO lever first.
Right.
You use NCR to flood the environment, create an abolishing operation, and drop the dangerous behavior to 0 safely. Then, once the environment is stable and safe, you can introduce the SDs to teach appropriate communication through FCT. You have to know the difference between manipulating the want and manipulating the get.
It is all about separating the internal drive from the external signals. If you misdiagnose the antecedent, your entire intervention is built on sand. Think about your own behavior today. When you react to a stressful situation, pause and ask yourself, are you responding to a genuine SD that signals a clear path to success, or is a massive unchecked motivating operation making you see SDs where there are only S deltas? If this helped you, follow behavioral intelligence, share this episode with another RB2 or BCBA who's studying, and leave a comment or review. That's how we grow and how I keep creating high-level content for you.
At Amethyst Therapy Services Inc., we build clinicians, not just test passers. www.amethysttherapyservices.com. info@amethysttherapyservices.com.